Shalom, children. Today we are celebrating another special day of Yahweh's called Shavuot. A few weeks ago, we read a parasha that told us what these special days are called. Do you remember? They are called appointed times. Appointed times are the days that Yahweh set aside for us to meet with Him, or have an appointment with Him. Just like you might have an appointment to go to the dentist on a certain day. However, unlike a dental appointment, we don't go to an office to meet with Yahweh. We meet with Him when we put aside going to work or school, and instead gather together to praise and worship Him. Not too long ago, we celebrated the appointed times of Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. We learned a lot about what the Israelites did on that first Passover and what Yahweh wants us to do also. Do you remember what we ate during those days? That's right, matzah. In the same way we learned about Passover and the days of unleavened bread, today we are going to learn about Shavuot and what Yahweh wanted the Israelites to do. A long time ago, the Israelites moved to their new land called Canaan. They became farmers, planting and harvesting things to eat, as well as herders, that is, people who take care of animals. The Israelites had to grow and gather, or raise everything they needed to make the food that they ate. They didn't have grocery stores like we do. The crops and herds also provided the Israelites with the ingredients that Yahweh wanted them to use for their offerings to Him. One of the offerings we talked about was the grain offering. We learned about different kinds of breads that were given as an offering to Yahweh. Some bread was flat and some bread was leavened. On this special day called Shavuot, the Israelites had to bring 2 loaves of the leavened kind of bread to the priest. He waved them in the air to present them as an offering of the first fruits of their crops to Yahweh. We don't gather our grain here or have a temple to take bread to, but there are some things that we do to celebrate this day. One of those things is counting time, so we know on what day to observe Shavuot. Yahweh tells us that we need to count 50 days after the Sabbath of unleavened bread. We call this counting the Omer. Today we have finished this year's count, and we are ready for the celebration. A way to remember this day is to have a set-apart gathering, or not go to work or school. Another thing we will do to make this day special is to read a Bible story about a woman named Ruth. This story relates to Shavuot because it talks a lot about the harvest and Torah. We will see how the people were following many of the rules Yahweh gave in His Torah, rules that we have already learned about. Our story happened many years after the Israelites had already moved to the land. They had made homes for themselves and started doing their jobs. The story of Ruth begins with a family that lived in Bethlehem. There was a mother named Naomi and a father named Elimelech. They had 2 sons named Machlon and Kilion. Do you remember the stories of Abraham having to move his family to Mitzrayim because of a famine? And later on, Abraham's son Jacob had to move his family to Mitzrayim too. Well, the shortage of food happened again, and now it was Elimelech's family that had to move. They chose to move to a nearby land called Moab. Moab was one of those lands that Yahweh wanted His people not to imitate in their behavior. Yahweh had said that the Moabites were so bad that they could not become His people, not even for 10 generations. I don't know how long they had been living in Moab, but sadly the head of the family, Elimelech, died. Naomi still had her 2 sons, and they had decided to get married. They didn't wait to go back home to marry Israelite women. Instead, they married 2 Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. They all lived in Moab for about 10 years. Then sadly both the sons died too. Naomi was very sad. Her husband and both her sons were gone, and she was not living near any other family members. One day, Naomi heard that Yahweh had blessed the Israelites, and how they now had bread to eat. Naomi decided it was time to go back to Bethlehem. Her 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws began the journey with her. But then Naomi decided it was not fair to make the 2 women move so far away from their families. She urged them to go back home to Moab and see if they could get new husbands. She told them she would not be upset with them if they left her, and that she hoped they would be blessed. The 2 young women were very sad. They cried and hugged her, and at last Orpah said goodbye and headed back home. Ruth said she wasn't willing to say goodbye to her dear mother-in-law, and told Naomi that she wanted to stay with her. Even though Naomi urged Ruth to go back to her hometown and to the familiar gods of her own nation, Ruth said no. She begged Naomi not to make her leave, but rather to let her go with her to Bethlehem. She truly wanted to worship Yahweh and learn how to become an Israelite. Can you guess what time of year it was when Naomi and Ruth traveled back to Bethlehem? It was the beginning of the barley harvest, exactly the time of year when Israel would have been celebrating Shavuot. And that's why we read this story at this time of the year. When Naomi and Ruth arrived in town, Naomi's old friends welcomed her back. Naomi told them she was sad because Yahweh had taken away her husband and sons. She felt her life was no longer happy, but bitter and gloomy. She asked them not to call her Naomi anymore, but to change her name to Mara, which means bitter. Do you remember some of Yahweh's rules for the grain harvest? One rule was not to be greedy by picking up all the grain off the ground when it was harvested. Yahweh knew that there would be poorer people who would have no fields to provide grain, so they were permitted to come and pick up some of the grain that was left behind. Ruth must have heard about this because she asked Naomi if she could go and pick up some of the leftover grain for them to eat. When Ruth went to glean the grain left behind by the reapers, she ended up in a field belonging to a wealthy man named Boaz. Now Boaz just happened to be a relative of Naomi. Boaz was very rich, and he had hired servants to take care of his fields. He had just returned from a trip away from home and was looking over his fields when he noticed Ruth among those who were gathering leftover grain. Boaz asked his manager, "Who is this young woman?" The manager explained that it was a girl from Moab, Naomi's daughter-in-law, and that she was gathering grain for food because they didn't have husbands to take care of them. Boaz went over to Ruth and told her to gather grain only from his field so he could make sure that she was safe. He also told Ruth that when she got thirsty, she could drink from the same water as his workers did. Oh, Ruth was very happy to hear this and asked Boaz why he was being so nice to her. Boaz, who knew Yahweh's Torah, told her that he admired her goodness to Naomi and her courage in coming to a strange place where she didn't know the customs and the rules that they lived by. Ruth was amazed that this man could be so kind to someone who looked and seemed so different from the people who lived there. Boaz told her that since she had decided to find refuge with Yahweh, it was Yahweh himself who was taking care of her. Boaz knew Yahweh's command not to treat strangers unkindly, because the Israelites themselves had been strangers in Mitzrayim. He invited Ruth to lunch, and so she sat down to eat with him and his hired servants. Boaz did not want to embarrass Ruth, who did not know all the rules of gleaning, so he asked his servants to let her pick grain from anywhere she wanted. He also told them to leave some extra, so she had plenty to pick from. Ruth worked hard. She didn't take the gift for granted. She had been given a good way to provide for herself and her mother-in-law. She was so excited to come back and show Naomi all the grain she had gathered. And Naomi was surprised to see so much grain and wanted Ruth to tell her all about her day. Ruth told Naomi where she had gone and all about Boaz and his kindness toward her. Naomi was excited to tell Ruth that Boaz was her relative. She realized that Yahweh was still taking care of her, even though she hadn't seen it earlier. Ruth and Naomi now had no worries about what they would eat each day. Ruth worked hard the whole season that the barley and the wheat were being harvested. Naomi saw how hard Ruth had been working, and she felt that Ruth needed to have a good husband. She explained to Ruth another of Yahweh's rules called the law of kinsman redeemer. This law said that when a woman's husband died with no children, a close relative could marry her, take care of her, and give her children. Naomi told Ruth just what to do so that Boaz would know she wanted to be redeemed by him. Ruth did just as Naomi taught her, and Boaz let her know how happy he was to find out that she wanted him for her husband. Even though Boaz was older and there were a lot of young men she could have married, he was glad Ruth wanted to do things the right way, the way Yahweh had given in his Torah. Boaz explained to Ruth that even though he wanted to redeem her, he said that there was another close relative who had the right to redeem her first. Boaz promised to ask the other man for permission to redeem Ruth himself, and gave her lots more barley to take home to Naomi. Naomi was happy to hear the good report and told Ruth that Boaz would do the right thing. According to the rules, there had to be witnesses when Boaz and the other person decided who would do the redeeming. If you were a man wanting to redeem and care for a piece of land that had belonged to a relative, the rule was that you also had to take care of his widow, that is, the woman whose husband had died, a woman like Ruth or Naomi. Boaz told the other relative that he could redeem the land, but he would also have to take care of the widow Ruth and give her a child who would grow up to own the land later, after he had died. The other relative was not keen on that idea. Boaz was hoping for that answer. One of the customs when two men made a land deal was that one man handed his sandal and gave it to the other man in front of witnesses, so everyone could see it. So the nearest kinsman redeemer took his sandal off and handed it to Boaz, and the deal was done. I wonder if he brought along an extra sandal to go home that day. The witnesses all agreed that the deal was done and spoke blessings to Boaz for doing the right thing. And soon enough, Boaz and Ruth got married, and Yahweh blessed them for doing the right thing and following Torah. The women of the town praised Yahweh because they saw how well he had rewarded Ruth and Naomi for their trust in him. Even though Ruth had not grown up knowing the rules of Yahweh, she had proven herself by working hard, learning Torah, and obeying it. We too must remember to always follow Torah and do as Yahweh tells us, even when it's hard. Soon Ruth and Boaz had a baby, and once again the women were joyful to see how blessed Naomi was through Ruth. What a beautiful story! We have seen that when we follow Yahweh's Torah, it blesses us and other people as well. We can cause others to praise Yahweh just by being obedient and letting them see Yahweh taking care of us. Ruth's story brings great joy and hope because it shows us how any person, no matter what their past or where they came from, they can choose to obey Torah, follow Yahweh, and become one of his children. Well, children, we have come to the end of our story for today. So we will see you next time. Shalom.
This is the day that Yah has made. We will rejoice and be glad.